Good morning, everybody. I'm glad that y'all are here. We have a small group. I should have done either the virgin birth or something about mothers today, but we're going to do the story of the wrestling match, Jacob wrestling with the angel, the man, the God. Depends on which source you look at. But I'm glad y'all are here. There are handouts by the coffee pot, so help yourself. And we'll start with a prayer. Let me pull up that on the screen. And it's at the top of your handout as well. Let's start by praying that prayer out loud together. O God of peace, who has taught us that in returning and rest we shall be saved, in quietness and confidence shall be our strength. By the might of your Spirit, lift us, we pray, to your presence, where we may be still and know that you are God, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. This is the last class in this series. Welcome, come in, grab a handout if you'd like one. It's the last class in the series. We could do 12 more of these, right? Because there are lots of passages in the Bible that are larger than a simple reading. And whenever I encounter a passage like that that sort of asks me to strain credulity, I am drawn more deeply into the question, why? Like, why is this passage written? Somebody once told me that like Bible study is about asking the what is written, preaching is about asking the why is it in the Bible. Even though this isn't a preaching class, I do think asking the question why helps me get a deeper look at these passages and understand the story a little better. I also think that the contemporary Western tendency to scrutinize texts for their historicity and their veracity would kind of squash the imagination of the ancient readers. I think the ancient community would struggle to understand why we care so much about it. As we finish today, let me remind you where we've been. We looked at Balaam and the talking donkey, and we saw how God, at least as the story goes, used the talking donkey to show Balaam what otherwise Balaam might not have been able to see. We looked at Jonah and the whale, and we noticed the ways in which the whale, a part of the story, Jonah and the fish, the fish part of the story has less to do with a Pinocchio-like moment, but the sort of strange nature of God's power and God's salvation for Jonah, and likewise for those to whom Jonah was called to preach a message of repentance. Then we looked at Jesus cursing the fig tree, and I loved that text because it probably has less to do with the fig tree and more to do with what it represents, kind of a hyperbolic, metaphorical teaching that Jesus seems to be offering for not only the disciples, but for us as well. If it were just a story about figs, we would be left with a depiction of Jesus that leaves us wanting, kind of a hangry Jesus. But if we allow that to be more a teaching tool, then perhaps we can see more. Last week, we looked at the Exodus story, and I loved how we expanded our reading of the crossing through the Red Sea to notice how different the nation of Israel's attitude was. At first, everything went well, and they were confident. Then Pharaoh and his army chased them, and they were afraid. Then God opened the sea so that they could walk across, and then it returned to its normal depth. And all the way through, the question that I returned to was, all right, what is God trying to teach us? What is God trying to teach others? What is God trying to teach the whole world? And again, it's a lot more than just a story of salvation and punishment. There's a lot more about who is the real God and how do we remember that story. Today we're going to look at a story that I think it's underappreciated. It's the story of Jacob wrestling with, I'm going to say the angel, although the word angel doesn't really appear in the text. Jacob wrestling with the angel. I think it's an interesting story, but I think we underappreciate how central it is, not only to the life of Jacob, but to the life of God's people. It becomes perhaps as central a text for the Judeo-Christian story as the Exodus does. So I'm glad that we're finishing with that. I've got the text split up into 3 sections. None of them is particularly long. We're going to read Genesis chapter 32. Would somebody be willing to read the first section for us? Who would read the first section of Genesis 32? Thank you, Brandy. Let me hand you this microphone. There you go. Just the first, until you see the questions, until you see number one. There are handouts by the coffee pot. If you didn't get one when you came in, you're welcome to it. Kick us off.
Okay. Jacob went on his way, and God's messengers approached him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And he named that sacred place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau toward the land of Seir, the open country of Edom. He gave them these orders: "Say this to my master Esau. This is the message of your servant Jacob. I lived as an immigrant with Laban, where I stayed till now. I own cattle, donkeys, flock, men servants, and women servants. I'm sending this message to my master now to ask that he be kind." The messengers returned to Jacob and said, "We went out to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you with 400 men." Jacob was terrified and felt trapped. So he divided the people with him and the flocks, cattle, and camels into two camps. He thought, if Esau meets the first camp and attacks it, at least one camp will be left to escape.
Thank you. Yeah, Dean's going to run the microphone. Thank you, Dean. I appreciate that. All right, so before I ask you what you notice, help me fill in the gaps, right? You remember the story of Jacob and Esau. Let me remind you how we got here. Jacob and Esau, twin brothers, right? Esau comes out first. Jacob's clutching his heel as the birth story is recalled. Some of us have interesting birth stories. And sometimes our parents and our aunts and uncles, occasionally our siblings, will remember our birth story because it seems to say something about our lives, right? Oh, you came on a holiday, or you came after 40 hours of labor and you've been a pain ever since, right? We use that kind of language, right? So the birth story reflects a truth that follows out. So Jacob comes out clutching Esau's heel, and you'll remember only one can be blessed. And of course, it's the firstborn, Esau, but Jacob and his mother trick their father, Isaac, into giving the blessing to Jacob. Remember, Jacob puts like goat hair on his arms and wears the robe because Isaac his sight was failing, and after Esau had sold his brother his birthright in exchange for a bowl of lentil soup, now it seems that Jacob sort of steals the blessing, and by the time the truth is revealed, Isaac says, "I'm sorry, I have one blessing to give," and it's Jacob's, and then almost pronounces a curse upon Esau and says, you're going to be on the run for your whole life. So that's kind of the story. Then to get us here, Isaac and his wife, not Rachel, Isaac and Sarah. No, Sarah blank and Rachel. Who's Isaac's spouse? Anyway, whoever his spouse, it'll come back to me in a minute. Recognize that Jacob's life is in danger, and so sends him back to get a spouse from his own kindred people. So he's been living with Laban, and then he ends up with two wives, Rachel and Leah, and now he's come back. So that's where we've landed. So we've got this unresolved conflict, maybe even deadly conflict between twin brothers, Esau and Jacob. And now Jacob is on his way back into his family's territory, and this is the episode that follows. Now, what do you notice? Like, now that I've sort of reminded us, what do you notice? What's of interest to you in that reading that we have so far? What sticks out to you? Raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
Didn't include himself in the first camp.
He didn't include himself in the first camp. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. All right, what else do you notice? It's like the old Star Trek. If you're wearing red, you're in trouble, right? You're not going to make it back from that away mission, right? The one that nobody knows, right? So if you can see that Jacob's in the other camp, you know you're in trouble, right? Yeah. What else? Yeah, what else do you notice in the passage? Notice, so what's Jacob's strategy? Brandy in the middle, but she wasn't going to answer that. So y'all think about what's Jacob's strategy and why was it necessary? But Brandy, what came to your mind first?
I feel like Jacob is having like a hands down approach to Esau. Like that's a therapy term. Sorry, it's like more of a I'm going to kind of I don't know. I'm going to be your servant type of thing. Like I am going to. The strategy, I think, is to make Esau feel higher than himself.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some deference there, right? Mm-hmm. Jacob doesn't adopt a position of strength, mm-hmm. right? He offers a conciliatory approach. He says, I own all this property, and I'm sending you this message so that you might be kind. Just to sort of see, can we bygones be bygones? He doesn't show up with a fighting force. He doesn't say, please go tell my brother, the one who didn't get the blessing, right? He's not gonna mention that part. So it's a fairly meek position. Yeah. And what's Esau's response? 400 men. 400 men. And in the Bible, when we see that word men in a group like this, it means of fighting age. It doesn't just mean males. It means warriors. It means soldiers. So Jacob says, he sends messengers to say, hey, your brother's coming back home, hopes that you'll be kind. And Esau says, okay, 400 people, go after him. Now, we don't know exactly what the order is at this point, but Jacob's response is to be terrified in verse 7. Jacob was terrified and felt trapped. So much so that he's not trying to think about how to escape with everything or an appeasement strategy. He's already ready. He's counting his losses. Like, cut it in half. Cut it in half. Children, spouses, family, property. Like, we will sacrifice half of everything that I've got in order to preserve the other half. Because at this point, Jacob doesn't have 400 people to fight for him. He's worried that this is going to be a slaughter and there will be none left. Yeah. Other thoughts? I think the reader of this, so let me say the Bible's really good about not leaving unanswered details. We might not get the answers we want, but like major issues usually get resolved because this story's been told over the generations. And we know that something's got to happen to fix that. Like either somebody's got to die, or there's got to be reconciliation, or there's got to be some fighting. Like we have to resolve that. And it's been years since, but the reader knows something's going to happen here. And so as we, the reader, approach this story, I think we're expecting conflict. Jacob ran for his life. Rebekah is his mother, by the way. Jacob ran for his life. His mother said, look, Esau's going to kill you. Go away. And now he's got to come back because he can't stay with Laban. That relationship fell apart as well. So he's got to come back. So things are tense, and this is where we've gotten so far. All right, let's read the next section because it's only at the end. Well, hold on. I have the second question I want to ask. All right, verses 1 and 2. Jacob went on his way, and God's messengers, that means angels, approached him. When Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. And he named that sacred place Mahanaim. What's the connection between those two verses and everything that follows? Do you see one yet? Anybody see a connection? They kind of feel odd. They feel like I went and looked at the previous chapter to see if maybe they belong with that part of the story. They don't. It's just kind of this little appendage. Anybody have a theory as to why about the connection? Anybody have a theory about that? About why those two verses start this chapter? Well, hold on to it. We'll come back to it. All right. Who would read for us the next section, which starts with verse 9 and goes on until verse 21? Who would read that next bit for us, please? Thank you.
Jacob said, Lord, God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I'll make sure things go well for you. I don't deserve how loyal and truthful you've been to your servant. I went away across the Jordan with just my staff, but now I've become 2 camps. Save me from my brother Esau. I'm afraid he will come and kill me, the mothers and their children. You were the one who told me, I will make sure things go well for you, and I will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, so many you won't be able to count them. Jacob spent that night there. From what he had acquired, he set aside a gift for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 nursing camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He separated these herds and gave them to his servants. He said to them, Go ahead of me and put some distance between each of the herds. He ordered the first group, When my brother Esau meets you and asks you, Who are you with? Where are you going? And whose herds are these in front of you? Say, They are your servant Jacob's, a gift sent to my master Esau. And Jacob is actually right behind us. He also ordered the second group, the third group, and everybody following the herds. Say exactly the same thing to Esau when you find him. Say also, Your servant Jacob is right behind us. Jacob thought, I may be able to pacify Esau with the gift I'm sending ahead. When I meet him, perhaps he will be kind to me. So Jacob sent the gift ahead of him, but he spent that night in the camp.
Thank you. What do you notice? What's interesting to you about that passage? Yeah, Trent, all the way up front. Thanks, Dean. We're working on the air conditioner in here. I know you're relieved to hear that. I'm not sure exactly when it'll be installed, but we're working on it. Yes?
So, yeah, I'm struck by the fact that Jacob is as cunning in his reunion with his brother as he was in deceiving his brother.
Yeah.
So
Takes after his mama, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, some things never change, right? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What else do you notice? What else do you notice in the passage? Yeah. Thank you, Karen.
Jacob stays behind. He's not behind the first one or the second one, but apparently all the way in the back.
Yeah.
Unafraid or unwilling to confront his brother.
Yes. Yes. Have you ever had to mediate a family conflict? And if you've ever had to mediate it, have you ever been a part of that strategy, which is, look, you don't come in first. Let me talk to him first. Let me remind him that you are his child, that he loves you. And then after I get a chance to soften things up, then you come in and be really nice, right? So there's a sense in which, yeah, that like it's a strategy, right? He's not in the front, he's in the back, yeah. And remind him I'm coming right behind him. He's on his way, yeah, yeah, yeah. What else do you notice? What else do you notice in the passage? What else? In the first bit, when Jacob is terrified and feels trapped, and he splits it up into 2 camps, maybe one will escape. I feel some conflict or some tension between that and the end of verse 20 when Jacob says, maybe he'll be kind to me. Like, I'm curious, how much hope do you think Jacob is holding out? Like, is Jacob... Like, it's odd to me that it feels like I don't know, maybe he's calmed down a little bit, maybe the initial panic. How do you interpret the, oh my gosh, half my people and possessions are going to be killed, versus, you know what, I might get away with this. He might be kind to me after all if I send him enough property. How do you reconcile that tension if you perceive one? If you don't, say so. What do you think? Yeah, Liz.
I think he's resolved that the meeting's inevitable, and he's done all he can do. So whatever happens, he's just going to have to live with it.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's covered trying all his options. Yep, best he can. Yeah, Karen.
if Esau has 400 troops to send, then surely Esau has done well for himself.
Yes.
Even though they parted ways a long time ago and it appeared that Esau was going to be destitute, he isn't. And surely the Edomites, he knows about the Edomites, he knows that they're prosperous. Esau doesn't really have a reason to have such a grudge anymore.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, and I think there's you remind me, there's something about property, right? If he's, first of all, Esau sold him his birthright. He stole the blessing, but he stole the birthright. There's a lot to be said about that. But because Jacob steals the spot of firstborn, all the property sort of falls to him. And Esau, as you anticipated, is kind of left out. Not completely out, and he's done fine for himself. But interesting that I wonder how much of these gifts, I wonder how much they represent a sort of a remuneration, a making up for it, right? Reparations, if you will, Trent. Or an atonement. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. What's the connection between the prayer? Let's go to the prayer. I love this prayer. I love it because it sounds like a lot of prayers that I've said in my life. Come on, God, you brought me this far. You're not going to leave me abandoned now, are you? Right? I love this prayer. There is in verse 11, save me from my brother Esau, an acknowledgement of his fear, but it's a sandwich, right? You have been so good to me. I haven't deserved it. You've made me prosperous. I'm really afraid of my brother Esau. Please save me. By the way, you are the one who told me I'm going to make everything go well for you, and I'm going to bless you with descendants, right? As if God needs to be reminded of God's promises. What's the connection between this prayer and the response that Jacob offers? And I've suggested two possibilities. You might have more. One possibility is that this response is the fulfillment of that prayer, that Jacob has offered that prayer and then enables it to come to pass through this gift. Another option that I've suggested in the handout is that Jacob has offered this prayer and then said, just in case God wasn't listening, let me take matters into my own hands and see if I can work it out. How do you make sense of the prayer? And how do you make sense of its connection with what Jacob does after? Thoughts about the prayer? Do prayers like that work? And on whom do they work? Trent, up front, right here, yep.
Well, it's a pretty standard strategy. I mean, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of my college roommates said that his grandfather always said, aim for the stars. If you don't get there, at least you won't be on the ground. That's like, yeah, thanks. Yeah. What else? What else do you make sense of this prayer? I'm fascinated with the relationship between God's actions and our actions when it comes to prayer. Like I think I tend to, especially when I'm reading a biblical example of prayer, I tend to imagine that God works by magic. Like if I say the right prayer, God will answer it. And so when I encounter a prayer like this, where Jacob seems to plead with God and then take matters into his own hands, I seem to think like he's covering all his bases. But I'm not sure God works any differently today than God worked back in Jacob's day. Like I think actually, if anybody needs to be reminded of this, it's Jacob, right? And perhaps it's the regurgitation of, I went away across the Jordan with just my staff, but now I've become two camps. Maybe that frees Jacob up from his attachment to his possessions. Maybe that frees him up from associating the possessions with his security. I don't know. I tend to expect prayers to just sort of be answered by magic in the Bible. I don't expect that to happen in my life, but somehow I don't allow God to be quite as subtle in the Bible as I expect God to be in my own life. And so I like to hear some surprising subtlety in the text. Yeah, Brandy.
I think it's a prayer of fear and desperation.
Yep.
And I mean, we've all done that, right? Like, been in a situation where we're very fearful, we're very desperate. Also, he seems to be almost processing his life with God, like kind of summing it up really quickly so that he can ruminate about it in his mind, like, okay, I've done this and I've done this, and I'm desperate for your help.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the theories about the Psalms is sort of focuses on the nature of their composition, and in particular, how often before offering a petition, like deliver me from my enemies, there's the regurgitation of, you are the God of our ancestors, or the God who saved me so far my whole life long. And I do think it's absolutely a prayer born of fear. I think there's an interesting tension between whether God needs to be reminded of God's goodness or whether we need to be reminded of God's goodness. Yeah, that's right. You are the God who's been with me my whole life long. Maybe I don't need to be as afraid as I feel right now. Like there's this odd sort of overlap there. And I think in some ways it depends on which generation you ask, right? It depends on whom you ask. What sort of God are you praying to? Are you praying to a God who needs to be reminded of God's goodness? Or are you praying to a God who already knows and loves and responds, and you need to be reminded of God's goodness, right? I mean, who's the lesson for? But sometimes it takes that form, especially out of fear. Yeah. Any responses to that? Well, let's read the climax of the story, if you will. And as you hear this bit, verses 22 through the end, verse 32, as you hear this, I want you to listen. In the yellow, yep. I want you to listen for the ways in which you hear different voices. And I want you to ask, at what point does it feel like different members of the family are telling this story and get their own lines in there? So yes, thank you.
Jacob got up during the night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River's shallow water. He took them and everything that belonged to him, and he helped them cross the river. But Jacob stayed apart from it by himself, and a man wrestled with him until dawn broke. When the man saw that he couldn't defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in Jacob's thigh as he wrestled with him. The man said, "Let me go because the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I won't let you go until you bless me." He said to Jacob, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer, but Israel, because you struggle with God and men in one." Jacob also asked and said, "Tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask for my name?" And he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I've seen God face to face and my life has been saved. The sun rose as Jacob passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh. Therefore, Israelites, don't eat the tendon attached to the thigh muscle to this day, because he grabbed Jacob's thigh at the tendon.
Thank you. Little anatomy lesson. Do y'all remember anybody eat Hebrew National hot dogs? I like Hebrew National hot dogs. They're pretty good. They're not my favorite hot dog. I'm a connoisseur of hot dogs, if you can't tell. But do you remember, it's been a while, but Hebrew National used to have commercials on television. There was a brief while where they ran commercials on television, and it was the punchline was no buts, right? And essentially, kosher beef is almost always just from the front part of the cow, not the back part. The back part itself isn't not kosher. It is not profane, but you have to be able to separate that tendon and the nerves around it, and it's just complicated, and so it's just easier to leave that for somebody else. And so there's this great sort of commercial with no butts, and like there's a sort of an animated cow, and then didn't really look like a cow, but sort of the outline of the cow, and then the back half just disappear, and so you know these are kosher hot dogs, right? Like this is it. This is the reason, and I always think of Jacob in the story because of that. All right, so what do you notice? What do you notice other than the hot dog part? What do you notice? What do you notice in the text? What's going on here? What happened? What just happened? Yeah, Richard up here, and then just Richard, yeah.
One thing that strikes me is it seems like if a man came and wrestled with him, there'd be a little more setup, and it would be just the last half of the sentence. It would deserve its own paragraph. That seems strange to me, the way they present that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It almost comes out of nowhere. Surprise attack. Yeah, Karen in the back.
It seems to me that Jacob is wrestling with his conscience, and that maybe there's a real person there, and maybe there isn't.
Yeah.
And it also seems that if this man was an angel, he would have supernatural powers, and Jacob would not be able to keep him down all night long.
Yeah, there's some problems. There's some problems in this, right? Yeah, Adam, and then Brandy.
In the first part of this and the last part of the last section, is Jacob, do we know, or is he preparing to flee and not make amends with his brother? And that's maybe why, maybe that prompts this
Yeah, is he going to go the other way
supernatural roughhouse.
and just save himself and start all over?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Because, he gets up in the middle of the night. Maybe in his defense, maybe the trip to Esau's takes that long.
Yeah.
But he kind of does, sneaks around.
Yeah, maybe. Brandy and then Trent.
First, this is like my most favorite story. I've been looking forward to this for a while. But I really think that Jacob wrestled with either God or an angel. I think that it's true that angels should have superpowers, but I also think that God would have kind of evened them up a little bit, because I think God saw that Jacob was truly wrestling with what was going on. And I use this as a metaphor a lot of times in my life in the past when I've had super difficult things to do, and I would say I'm wrestling with God, and it from this story. And so I really think that Jacob has been wrestling in his mind with God, praying and fear and desperation, and then I think God really does send someone to wrestle this out, kind of in a way of saying, how important is this to you?
Yeah.
How long can you hold
Yeah.
on to this?
Yeah, thank you. Trent, and then we'll come back to Adam.
Yeah, so two things. When Jacob asks, tell me your name, and he refuses to give his name, I'm kind of reminded of Moses in the burning bush and I am. Mm-hmm. And whoever he wrestled with had the power to change his name. To me, that's a clue that there's something going on here.
Yeah.
And what I love about this story is in Education for Ministry, which I've been a part of for 8 years, first-year students sometimes come into it reading the Old Testament with this sense of treating it with kid gloves, like they're afraid to really ask their real questions. And this story is one that I always come back to, like, look, Israel was named Israel because it wrestled with God, and that's what you're invited to do here. And if you don't, maybe you're missing the point of the class.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Adam, back in the middle.
Something I was just thinking about since revisiting it this time is, how do you think this wrestling match kind of, was it like ding and then they started wrestling, or was it like, did an angel appear and start kind of poking at Jacob and like, what are you going to do, wrestle me? Bet you won't. It's just funny. It's something I was thinking about.
Yeah. So let me offer a couple of observations, and then I'll throw it back to you. I love this text because I think it's a great example of how different traditions come together into a story, how the community, we might say the author, but the communal author of the story incorporates different traditions in order to give us something as we have it. But I also like, as Trent points out, that it explicitly invites struggling with the story, right? Like anybody who would say, I'm sorry, that's what the Bible says, you're just going to have to deal with it. like hasn't been paying attention to Genesis 32, right? Fundamental to our identity as the new Israel, if you will, as descendants, spiritual descendants of Jacob, is like built into our name is this process of wrestling. So I think that's there. But notice the different threads, right? And whenever you read a passage and you're like, why did they do it differently there? I don't understand that. It usually means different voices are having a say here. So notice that at the beginning, Jacob got up during the night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River's shallow water. He crossed. He took them and everything that belonged to them and helped them cross the river. But he stayed apart by himself. Some translations say he stayed back on the other side. Like, did he cross back over? Did he send them away and then did he sneak away from them? Did he stay over there and sort of shout at them across? Why is he across the river? What's going on with the river? What's happening here? Similarly, right, we've got this name. We've got sort of who's he wrestling with? Man, God, the one whose name cannot be spoken. I mean, you can't miss those kind of connections. What's going on? Is it a man? Is it God? But the ways in which this figure are described is most definitely not the God of Israel, whose power seems to disappear at daybreak. Like what sort of divine-ish figure is this? If they disappear, is it a vampire? Like what's going on here, right? Then at the end we've got Peniel and Penuel. Like the person writing this down can tell that it's described one way, it's spelled one way first, and then one way second. A lot of people debate that. And some translations will even render it spelled the same way as if to sort of hide from us that sometimes the text doesn't agree with itself. But what did he name it? And what did they call it? And it's kind of like, I say Fayetteville. Some people say Fayetteville. Some people will say different ways. Like, it just, like if we might even spell it. If we were spelling it phonetically, we might spell it differently, right? So different people pronounce things different ways, and so the tradition is held. But what I love is that the tradition isn't interested in sterilizing the text and giving us a simple text. It's interested in giving us kind of the nuance and the complexity of it. My take, and it's not from me, it's synthesizing other opinions. My take is that before Jacob and anybody from Israel got there, the people in that land knew that this was a dangerous place to cross the river. It's a dangerous place to cross. Sometimes, if it had been raining upstream and you hadn't seen it, there'd be a gully washer, and if you could be crossing with your herd, and the next thing you know, without warning, the water would come down and wash away half your flock, maybe even your servants who are there on the water as well. And so dramatic was this dangerous crossing that we might even say there's a spirit, an animistic spirit. So the pre-Israelite dwellers in this land probably talked about this area of the river as if there was a river god there, an angry river god that if you didn't say your prayers the right way, that river god could come and get you. Right? We don't believe that, but you know, in a simple way of explaining things, right? Maybe we explain it that way, right? Kind of like I read a meme the other day. If you want to know why I'm irrationally anxious, you can blame my parents who told me that if I went swimming right after I ate, I would surely drown, right? Right. So we tell people stories, right? So imagine if before Israel got there, this was a culture, and then the people of Israel said, all right, you know who we are as a people? We're a people who've struggled with God throughout all the generations. We've struggled with God. And our patriarch, Jacob, for whom we are named Israel, let's tell a story. Let's remember a story about a time when he was in danger and everything looked like it was going to fall apart, and yet he wrestled with God. And let's remember this story and tell this story in a way that not only heightens conflict, but also offers blessing and name change. And this is a great way to do that. And so I don't know who came up with the story first. I don't know if Jacob told the story the way that your grandfather tells you stories. But somehow the story picks up on the tradition of this ford of the river, the danger of it, an animistic spirit who apparently, we don't want to say the name, but loses its power at daylight, is the kind of spirit that Jacob could actually wrestle with and prevail, except for the very end, there's this kind of supernatural touching of the thigh joint and sets it out of joint. And Anyways, and so central is this story that we end up calling Jacob Israel. Right? The 12 tribes of Israel are Jacob's 12 sons. Jacob is no longer known as Jacob. He's Israel. We get the dietary restriction against not eating that tendon because of this moment. So this story shapes God's people daily for ever, in perpetuity, and it's the telling of the story that gets that. So what I want to do is I want to go back into the story and kind of wade in those details and then begin to ask, all right, so what really happened, and how would we tell it? And we all have stories like that. We have larger-than-life stories, and when the larger-than-life story meets the needs of the wider community, then we start teaching our children that story, and they teach their children that story. And it's not a local phenomenon, it's a cultural phenomenon, a national phenomenon, an ethnic phenomenon. And it becomes a sacred story, and it conveys a sacred truth. I can allow this story to be true in lots of different ways with different facets. But if the only thing we're worried about is, I wonder what sort of thing Jacob wrestled with, then we're going to miss the big picture. Right? I mean, God's sort of saying, why are you worried about that? Can't you see what's really going on here? So let me stop for a moment, having kind of filled some of that out. Let me ask you, so what's your response to that? How do you respond? Dean?
I think it's kind of an example of what everybody goes through. Jacob's life leading up to this point, he probably wasn't real proud of the deeds that he did. So there was guilt associated with it. And then the fear of having to confront and probably get the punishment that he deserved. So he put it off and continue to put it off. What I find really, I guess, confusing, I don't really understand, is I think the struggle with God and men, because he said you struggled with God and men and won. I don't know what he won. Like, he may have won the blessing, but not clear to me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great open question. Great open question. Yeah, what is it? I chose this translation in part because of that line. Because you struggle with God and with men and won. Often prevailed is the word that's used, but prevailed sounds so academic. We don't say that you prevailed in Wimbledon. We say you won, like you won, and I love that kind of that simplicity, which I don't know what it means. Yeah,
Couldn't prevail just being finish, you know?
Yeah.
So I take prevail as you were able to get through it. You were able to continue.
Yeah, but I think that's the point. I think what it means to struggle with God and win is not to best God, though this text seems to allow some of that, but to actually to know that the struggle itself is to prevail, right? To not shy from the struggle, to stick it out, to not give up. Yeah, with God or with those around us. Yeah, I think that's a sermon. There's a sermon in that, right? Yeah, absolutely. What else? Responses to this text, or what I've invited you to wonder about this text. Anybody want to say you're crazy? Don't ruin my Bible. I've loved this story since I was a kid. Why would you ruin it for me by talking about animistic spirits and wraiths and vampires? Yeah, Adam.
No, I love all that stuff you just mentioned. It's really opening up a lot of things in my brain. Hey, I was just looking up the tendon that is, that they don't eat. It equates to the sciatic nerve in a human, which is interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And really hard to get out of the meat, which is why they just lower half, we'll leave it to somebody else. Yeah, what else do you make of this story? So, one way to approach the Bible is all the things that happened that were really important got written down the way they happened. Another way to read the Bible is to say there's something really important to convey, and it's so important that this legend would evolve around it. Think about Arthur, right? The Arthurian legends, right? They convey something that may or may not have happened, but they convey a wonder. I mean, it's a story we tell. We make Disney movies out of it, right? So I think there's something really. If we only think of this as an episode that unfolded, then it's a good story to teach our children. It's interesting, and there's something to glean from it. But I feel so much more power in knowing who God's people are as the descendants of Jacob are the people who wrestle, struggle with God, and in the struggle prevail. And that's so foundational to our identity that this story gets written to tell that, to convey that. In the same way that, like, if I wanted my children to avoid that pond behind our house where they might drown someday, I might tell them a made-up story about the 8-year-old who wandered in that and drowned, and his mother's ghost is still seen wandering through the woods, weeping for the loss of her child, right? Just so that they would think, don't, you know. Eventually, it has the opposite effect, which is, we're going to see that, right? Usually about the time they're 12, which is why you got to sort of be careful what stories you tell your children. But, like, if you want to convey this truth in a way that is stronger than, hey, we're the people that wrestle with God, then you tie it up into this story, even if it has strange, bizarre details like the sun is about to rise, I've got to go, let me go, or else, right? So just in a way that doesn't work, we cannot fathom a God who would wrestle with us like that and not win. Like, what does it mean to wrestle with God? So central is that we would describe it using a narrative which allows for some truths that can't otherwise be conveyed. I mean, if I said to my children, let me tell you about God, our God is the kind of God who would wrestle with you on a riverbank all night long, and you might even win. And they say, what? Like, what do you mean by that? Like, it doesn't work that way, but the story gives it that. I think we have to read stories as stories and not just as proclamations of truth. Yeah.
Do you think this isn't as, I guess, I want to say well-known or popular, or whenever you're talking about biblical stories like Noah, because it is messier? Because there isn't that clear-cut black and white response to it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also it has to do with what you pointed out earlier, which is what sort of victory is this? Right? Because what comes next is he goes and meets Esau. And Esau embraces him, weeps on his neck. They are reconciled. He's like, why'd you send me all this stuff? You're my brother. Then Esau says, come back, let's live together. And Jacob goes, oh, I've got all the women and children. We're tired. We can't keep up with you. We'll catch up with you in a little bit. Jacob goes and lives somewhere else. Right? So there's this sense in which, this is only a part of the story. I think part of it, so I think part of it is, it's messy, but also the messiness is the struggle. And it's kind of hard to, it doesn't get wrapped up in a bow. I think you're right. Yeah. I think I want to fall back to this story. I think it's a good story. All right. I hope you've enjoyed our series. I love classes like this. You might have noticed that just about every class I teach that has anything to do with the Bible asks the question, how are we reading the Bible? I'm not interested in just the surface reading. I am interested in the surface reading, but I want it to be more than that because I think the Bible is more than that. And I hope that after each of these classes you think, all right, maybe this Bible has something to teach me and to teach us, but it's always better when we read it together. So I'm glad y'all were a part of the series. Next week, 175th anniversary celebration, we'll have a forum in here remembering some of the stories of our past. Then we have one more week, Memorial Day week, and then we'll start a new series on June the 1st. Hope to see y'all next week. Thank y'all so much.